Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this channel. And for those of you who are regular viewers, you will know that we do a lot of financial analysis. So we pick apart companies and their accounts, find out what's going on, help you to read and interpret that financial information. Well, today we're going to do something a little bit different. So I am very pleased to introduce my friend Johnny Wraith. So hello, Johnny.
Hello.
And Johnny is going to be talking to us less about companies and more about the markets in which companies operate. So whether you are looking for insight on investment decisions, whether you are just interested in kind of what's going on in the world from an economics point of view, maybe you've been listening to it on the TV, you've been reading about it in the newspaper, you're not quite sure what's going on, then Johnny is here to help us to join the dots effectively and improve our knowledge of what is actually going on out there. So my name is Ted Wainman, and we've been doing a lot of financial analysis, as I mentioned. Johnny, why should we be listening to you? I mean, why do you know what you're talking about?
Well, that's a good question to start with, Ted. I hope that I'm worth listening to about some of this stuff. I've had a long career in the city working for a number of investment banks. My main focus over the years has been on economics, interest rate markets, monetary policy, those sorts of areas. I've been an analyst, as I say, for several investment banks, most recently UBS, before that Merrill Lynch, RBS, Royal Bank of Canada. I've been doing that for about 30 years, focusing mainly on the UK, but also other parts of the globe, particularly Europe, the US, but of course all these markets and economies affect the UK as well. So a sort of fairly wide-ranging brief. I'm now a free agent, and hopefully I'm able therefore to share some of my thoughts about these markets, and as you say, what some of the dynamics in them mean for companies, equities, and the environment they're operating in. So that's me, and as I say, hopefully I can share some useful thoughts today.
Excellent. So fantastic, Johnny. And immediately you jump in and started using terms like monetary policy, and I'm sure there's a lot of our viewers will know what you mean by monetary policy, and there'll be a few who don't. So if you're not sure what Johnny is talking about, some of those interest rate policy, etc., then please do carry on watching. So first of all, Johnny, you used to work for these banks, you don't work anymore, and we've had a little conversation where you kind of feel liberated that you can now tell it as it really is without having to toe any line. Perhaps you could elaborate for our viewers on why it's good to listen to an independent consultant rather than just listening to the stuff that the banks kind of regurgitate.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think to be fair and transparent, clearly all of these banks and similar institutions have a huge amount of resources, a lot of very clever people working there and accessing those resources, and they come up with a huge amount of incredibly useful and informative research and analysis. I think, having said that there is a sort of understandable tendency for analysts and economists within those banks to sort of toe a very sort of middle of the road line on most things. I think that's partly because controversy doesn't sit well with institutions like that. I think it's also because they operate in environments where the main central banks and governments regulate them, watch them very closely, do a lot of business with them, and therefore there is an instinctive tendency for employees working within those banks to reflect positively on the policy choices that are determining how an economy is operating. It's very difficult, and I can say this partly from experience, to go out on a limb and to suggest that policy settings may not be optimal for the control of inflation or the optimal management of the economy, for employment and all of these issues. So perhaps there's a tendency for the very informed, very intelligent research and output from those banks to tend to sort of coalesce around a view that the economy is going to do well, inflation is going to be stable, unemployment's going to be low, and less of a tendency for those voices to say, well, hang on, maybe policy's too loose, maybe unemployment's going to pick up, maybe we're headed for a recession. You won't often hear those views from those sort of financial institutions, and perhaps you're more likely to hear them from people like me speaking independently.
Excellent. Okay, so that sounds good, but please, no conspiracy theories. I really don't have a bandwidth for conspiracy. Okay, so let's talk about. So you mentioned the word inflation there, Johnny. We read about it and we kind of get a feel it's just rising prices. Is that really what inflation is, or is there more to it than that?
At its simplest level, that's precisely what it is, Ted. Yeah, inflation is understood and interpreted to be a rise in the general price level. It's something, for reasons I'm sure we'll come on to, that is generally considered in macroeconomic terms to be a good thing as long as there's only a little bit of it. Clearly, as I'm sure everyone appreciates, inflation is a very varied concept. The prices of different assets, different goods and services rise at very different rates at any given point in time. So it's not necessarily a specific concept where it means the same thing to everybody, but on that overall economic level, it is a general rise in the price level. And as I say, it's something that policymakers try typically to generate a little bit of, but not too much. It's a sort of Goldilocks phenomenon. And as I say, I'm happy to explain why that is if you'd like me to.
Well, I think the Bank of England's target rate is I think 2%, and if they go above 3%, then they have to write a letter to the Chancellor. So certainly, there's going to be a lot of ink written on letters over the next few months. I think. I guess the other side of the coin from inflation is deflation. And quite frankly, I thought deflation would be a good thing, because if I don't like to see the price of my food going up, wouldn't it be nice to see the price of my food coming down? So why not? Why do we not target deflation, Johnny?
Good question. So essentially, the 2% level for the Bank of England, or the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England that you mentioned, is set by the Chancellor. They are charged with targeting 2% on the Consumer Price Index. As you rightly said, if it goes more than 1% above that, the Governor of the Bank of England has to write an open letter to the Chancellor explaining why that's happened and what they intend to do to bring it back to target. Incidentally, that letter also has to be written if it goes more than 1% below, which starts to bring us towards your question about deflation. Why does the government want the Bank of England to generate a little bit of price inflation? The basic reason, if I can put it like this, Ted, is if you have deflation or insufficient inflation in the judgments of those policymakers, the risk is that you get economic stagnation. Imagine, if you will, a good that you have had your eye on. I know you like the good things in life, Ted. And if you saw, let's just take an example, a new television, and you saw that it was in the shop window for £500, but you knew or thought that we were entering into a period of deflation where the general price level is falling, you might conclude that in 6 months' time, the price of that television will have fallen to £450, in which case you're highly unlikely to buy it today. You're much more likely to wait and in 6 months' time pick it up for a cheaper price. So what then obviously happens, if that is multiplied up onto the sort of macroeconomic scale, is that you enter a period of economic stagnation where you don't have that sort of creative tension in the economy that keeps things moving forward. What's the incentive for a company to keep making goods and services, to keep generating or trying to generate business so it can pay its employees and benefit its shareholders, if it knows that the goods it's making are to sit on the shelves while people wait for the price to fall? So there are different views about it, and clearly we'd all like to spend a bit less on food, goods, services, but if it's happening at that overall economic level, it can lead you to a place where you end up with stagnation. Companies are not incentivized to up production and try and become more competitive, more efficient, more productive. And therefore, of course, that ultimately leads to unemployment, to profits falling, and to a loss of economic momentum, which is punishing and painful from a whole number of reasons.
Okay, so it sounds to me like a little bit of kind of price falls is good, but proper deflation is not good for the economy. It's kind of recession, as you say, stagflation, and or stagnation, and so a little bit of inflation is going to bring forward my purchasing decisions and keep that economy ticking along. And everyone feels that they're getting a little bit richer because they get a little bit of a sort of pay rise, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So that sounds pretty good to me. So. And obviously, the global financial crisis, I think that was a kind of a big deflationary shock. But we didn't really experience. I mean, we kind of got through that quite quickly. What's caused the current inflation that we're kind of seeing at the moment?
Well, I think the best way to think about that, and perhaps include the financial crisis in this point as well, is to consider that in a very sort of simplistic economic sense, inflation is generated by an imbalance between supply and demand. If supply and demand were exactly in balance, which is obviously a hypothetical concept, but if they were across every aspect of the economy, nothing would ever move. There's an equilibrium, which means that demand meets supply. There's no need for price levels to change to influence demand and supply. When they go into imbalance, which is actually a sort of permanent state of affairs, but wherever that imbalance lies at any given time, that's what ultimately generates price pressures. If demand is hot, if demand is stronger than supply, it means there's effectively more money chasing fewer goods and services. So to get back into balance, the price of those goods and services will rise, and that will soften demand, because to go back to your point just now, Ted, if the price of something goes up, clearly your demand for it, your propensity to buy it will cool. Equally, if there's a fall in demand, whatever may trigger it, and obviously there's a myriad of things that can affect supply and demand. If demand falls away, then the price of things has to come down so that demand and supply come back into balance. There's too much stuff on the market and people aren't buying it. So that's the sort of basic concept we need to bear in mind here. To talk about the current situation, clearly, as I said, and as is always the case, there are literally millions of moving parts. But at the top line level, sadly, I think we all know what's driving the spike in inflation that we're seeing. The primary driver, I stress the primary one, certainly not the only one, is the shock to supply of gas and oil that has come about as a consequence of the awful conflict in Ukraine. As that has broken out, so the supply of Russian gas and oil has been affected. Demand artificially is being affected as well, but of course, economies haven't, on a global level, haven't really suffered. So overall, the demand for oil and gas is pretty much what it was 6 months ago, but the supply has suddenly fallen away. Artificially so, but if you want to put it this way, the supply of Russian oil and gas has been massively impacted by the conflict. So there is suddenly an awful lot of money chasing less supply of gas and oil, and guess what? The price has gone through the roof. Now, of course, gas and oil is an everyday expense for any of us, driving cars, heating our homes in a whole range of other ways, but it's also an indirect cost. Every good that's transported anywhere, part of the cost of transporting it is obviously the energy costs that it involves to move it from A to B. And if those energy costs rise, then ultimately the finished price of the good rises. So this sort of situation has generated an inflationary shock. As I said, it's not the only source of the current bout of inflation, which is why central banks are becoming increasingly concerned. But to finish this point for now, it is the main reason. And hopefully it makes sense to consider any shock to supply and demand as a potential catalyst for either a sharp increase in inflation, or, as you mentioned at the time of the financial crisis, a sharp, initially anyway, a sharp bout of deflation. Because what did the financial crisis do? It devastated demand. That's what it did up front. And as I said before, if demand suddenly weakens, then there has to be a fall in the general price level such that demand and supply come back into balance. And that's what happened on that occasion.
So it's interesting. So my understanding is in the global financial crisis, that you're right, there has a kind of a big deflationary force. The central banks then printed a lot of money, creating inflation, and that inflation they created combated the deflationary forces and kind of lessened the impact of the global financial crisis. And then fast forward to the pandemic was also deflationary, but was it deflationary because the central banks printed a ton of money, and actually it disrupted supply chains, which means that you've got more money and you've got less supply. That's got to be inflationary.
I think, this is a very interesting juncture here, because so far, Ted, we've talked about some of these macroeconomic forces that influence supply and demand, and the initial triggers for volatility in the price level, to put it that way. And then, of course, we come on now to, well, what do policymakers do about it? At the beginning of this talk, we mentioned and hopefully convinced some of the viewers that a bit of inflation is a good thing. Too much can become a very bad thing, and not enough for different reasons is also undesirable. So a little bit of steady inflation is what central banks, not just in the UK, but certainly in the US, in Europe, even in places like Japan, where they've struggled for many years to generate sufficient tension and inflation in the system. Most major central banks have inflation, at least as part of their remit, typically around 2%. Now, of course, some people will say, well, that's the wrong target, but it doesn't matter. That's what it is for now. So if something happens to push inflation violently away from target and potentially keep it away from target, what do policymakers do to try and bring it back to where they are charged with having it? At the Bank of England, as I say, the Monetary Policy Committee is responsible for CPI at 2%. It actually says in their remit at all times, although that's impossible when these shocks are clearly outside their control, and a lot of them are unforeseeable as well. So when it deviates, they have to set out policy aimed at bringing it back to target. And you mentioned the pandemic, you mentioned the financial crisis earlier. These are seismic events, to at least a great degree, completely unforeseeable. And the impact they have on supply and demand is incredibly unpredictable. Even now, I think you'd struggle to find somebody who said, I understand exactly what happened to supply and demand through the entire financial crisis, or through Brexit, or through the COVID pandemic. It's just too complex and multifaceted an issue. But what happened at the start of the pandemic, essentially, was that the Bank of England judged that the main consequence of a global pandemic and the lockdowns that it led to, and so on, was that there would be a massive fall in demand, which clearly there was, and that would be the biggest issue that they would have to confront. And their way of dealing with that, as a monetary policy setting body, in other words, the body that sets interest rates throughout the economy, was to say, well, how do we cushion that fall in demand? Because it's going to be excessive. It's going to lead to insufficient inflationary pressures. We cut interest rates. We reduce the cost of borrowing. So we're incentivizing people to borrow more or save less. The incentive for saving is reduced by the fact that the return you make on it, the interest rate you earn on it, is cut. So they reduce interest rates and hope, as I say, that cushions the excessive fall in demand. The slight problem they had at the start of the pandemic, of course, and this again isn't just a UK issue, is that interest rates were effectively already at or very close to zero. Now, there's another conversation for another day about negative interest rates, but by and large, we can accept that interest rates at zero is what they call the effective lower bound. If you're not earning any interest on your money, then, or if you're earning a tiny bit of interest and it's cut to zero, you might change the way you behave, but there's only so far central banks can take that rate. So they ran into a problem. What do you do when when interest rates can't be cut any further, but you still want to stimulate more demand? And the answer, as you rightly said, Ted, is that you bring in money printing, frankly, quantitative easing. Now, you can't just print money and throw it out at the general public, or at least you can if you're an independent central bank. and you have as the Bank of England does, as the Federal Reserve does, you have the complete autonomy over printing the currency. It's only the Bank of England that can create pounds sterling, literally print them in the money presses. The problem is, if you just create money out of thin air, you immediately devalue your currency on global FX markets. There's suddenly a lot more sterling around, but you haven't increased the value of the underlying economy, so every pound is worth less. So what the central bank did was to say, well, we're going to create money, but rather than just throw it into the economy and write a check to people, we're going to buy assets with it. We're going to buy government bonds. So the money is actually being used to buy assets. And that's quantitative easing at its heart. The basic aim is just to pump more money into the system, initially into the government bond market, but then it spills over into other assets as well. And that boosts the overall amount of money in the system. So by doing that, what you're trying to do is counteract these deflationary forces that you anticipate happening in this example as a result of the pandemic. Importantly, Ted, what you also, and rightly said, was that there was an enormous supply shock too, which wasn't necessarily anticipated by the central bank in the same way. And one very clear way of seeing why that happened was that lockdowns occurred globally. They're still going on, incidentally, in places like China, still pursuing a zero COVID policy. So when there's an outbreak of COVID, they lock down, same way that we did in the UK for months on end. Now, of course, if you're locking down in that severe way, you're stopping agents of economic production from working. Factories close, literally. People can't go to the office. Economic activity is suppressed. Supply falls. So what we actually saw in the pandemic was a big fall in demand, yes, as the Bank of England had predicted, met with a big round of quantitative easing, but also a big fall in supply. And arguably that wasn't anticipated to the same extent, either in the UK or elsewhere. And what that would lead you to is a conclusion that they did too much money printing. Too much QE was done by central banks all around the world because they were too pessimistic, essentially, about the scale of the hit to demand relative to supply. Now, we come back to the inflation situation at the moment. As we acknowledged, and it is clearly the case, a lot of the story about what's going on at the moment is the oil and gas situation relating to Russia. However, it has to be acknowledged there's also too much money chasing too few goods and services out there. Demand has been artificially inflated way beyond that equilibrium level. And that's why central banks now, arguably, are starting to panic. They're raising interest rates regularly and quite rapidly because what they have contributed to effectively is an overheating of the underlying economy. And they need to cool that down, or inflation could become more of a spiral, which leads to all manner of other problems further down the road. It's a very long-winded answer. I appreciate it. I hope I haven't sent you to sleep there, Ted, but hopefully it made a bit of sense.
Not at all. No. So I'm just going to kind of summarize that the banks were the central banks were printing money in response to the global financial crisis. They dropped interest rates. When the pandemic arrived, they thought it was going to be deflationary. They printed even more money. I was reading somewhere there's 23 trillion extra dollars from the 4 major central banks in the world, extra in the economy. So that's got to be inflationary. We've got supply chain shocks. That's deflation. That's inflationary. Sorry. And then suddenly you bring into the mix the war in Ukraine, and that is causing massive inflationary pressures. And the central banks are suddenly realizing that the word transitory, transitory inflation, it just doesn't hold any water, and they've got to do something about it. So, Johnny, we're out of time right now. I really want to know what the banks are going to do and why the central banks, the Bank of England, for example, thinks that by raising interest rates by 0.25% is going to mean that the petrol price at the petrol pumps is going to come down. I don't quite see the connection there, but that's for another time. So thank you very much indeed, Johnny. To our viewers, do please like, share, subscribe to the channel. If you've got a question, if there's anything you want to ask Johnny, we're going to do another one of these. If you want to ask him a question, you've heard about monetary policy, quantitative easing, modern monetary theory, inflation, deflationary, any of these kind of, negative bond yields, any of that kind of that stuff that Johnny's talking about, you want to understand exactly what it is, then please leave a comment in the comment box, and we will see if we can address your particular comments. If you've got a particular view of what Johnny's saying, whether he's right, whether he's wrong, again, leave a comment in the comments box, please, although do be polite if you disagree with him. So thank you very much indeed, Johnny, and look forward to doing this again. I think it's been really informative.
Anytime, Ted. Thank you. Thanks very much.